Talking about being transgender freaks me out. Being queer is such an outsider experience, and while it's a big part of my life, I always feel unqualified to talk about it. I've known that as transgender for a few years, but I feel like I only solidly settled my identity within the last year. Every single person's experience is so different, but there is something that connects all of us. We had to take a leap. The majority of people are not queer, and the queer community is definitely growing in size, but it's still a small community. It takes a lot of bravery to accept yourself as queer. Point being, there's a lot that goes into being transgender. It's a messy experience that, whenever I try to explain it, it sounds like I'm playing Mad Libs. People ask me how I realized that I'm transgender, and usually my answer is something along the lines of, something didn't feel right, but I didn't know what, until I realized that I was transgender. It's something that you don't ever fully understand unless you go through it yourself. Ultimately, that connection between me and other people is what makes being transgender beautiful. We all found ourselves in our jungle of discomfort. I hadn't ever really seen a catharsis captured in any form of media though, and that bugged me a bit. There were no movies where I could point to a transgender person on screen and go, this is me. Plenty of movies like that do exist, and have for decades, but until recently, I've been slacking on watching transgender movies. Instead, I found myself in the subtext of other characters who went through a spiritual journey of their own. So when I was digging through Letterboxd and I found I Saw the TV Glow, my curiosity was through the roof. It was a horror movie about two TV show obsessed teens, and apparently it tied into queerness. The trailer was ominous, and I watched it over and over again. I needed to see this movie. I was drawn to it. I felt myself living in the trailer, haunted by the suburbs, my obsession with movies, and the echoes of my own dysphoria. On May 12th, 2024, I took a long train ride to Boston to see the movie, and it made me the most disturbed that piece of media has ever made me. From the start, I Saw the TV Glow gets under your skin. The movie opens with a bunch of random noises, an art housey establishing shot, and then a kid watching TV by himself at night. It's this dumb low-budget young adult show, but he is clearly drawn into it. Immediately, we're set up with two of the main focal points of this movie, Owen and his television. But something feels off-putting about it, like maybe something's not quite right. Owen is shown being an isolated kid. He doesn't really have friends, and he seems very spaced out. The only time it feels like he's paying attention is when he talks to Maddie about the pink opaque, but he is awkward and nearly fumbles it. He wants to learn more, but he is too afraid to ask. Thankfully, Maddie offers him her episode guide. He ends up coming over for a sleepover to watch it at her house. A detail I love about the pink opaque is that there's arguably nothing inherently supernatural about its existence. The show is analogous to the numerous campy young adult shows of the late 90s and 2000s. The most obvious real-world comparison point is a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, particularly season 1. The monsters are silly and over the top, ranging from dancing moon twins to a big ice cream cone. The acting is cheesy and the characters have eccentric fashion styles. It's a show for teens that deals with issues relevant to them and allows for them to feel seen. Most importantly, the pink opaque isn't just a cute nod to this era of television. Instead, it uses these tropes to further highlight the queer struggles shown throughout this movie. The monsters of the week are all based on simple pleasures which distract from the big bad, Mr. Melancholy. The term melancholy is extremely apt, considering that melancholy is a form of sadness without an obvious cause, which is what Maddie and Owen are both experiencing. They're sad, but to confront the root of their issue, they have to overcome numerous small distractions. The pink opaque is an unrelated distraction for the plot and the characters, which is an extremely admirable decision to make. This type of camp media is practically tied to queerness. Camp has roots in queer culture, making it the perfect mirror for Owen to look at himself through. The show is cheesy to the audience, but real to Owen, which is maybe the most important distinction in all of I Saw the TV Glow. It doesn't matter what other people perceive something as, what matters is what it means to you. Watching the show clearly unlocks something in Owen. He's able to look at the screen and see someone, not just something, on the other side. However, he doesn't get to capitalize on that euphoric feeling. He gets pushed away from it and spends 2 years fantasizing about feeling that same way again, whilst never acting on it. Interestingly, this flavor of camp seeps out of the TV screen and into the broader film. Characters occasionally talk in a stiff, sometimes semi-awkward way that plays into the humor associated with camp. It's a style that may be more at home with queer audiences than cishet audiences, which can be seen both in-universe and in the real world. I Saw the TV Glow has been narrowly classified as just a transgender movie, with the campier elements often being picked apart as being bad or corny. In a way, I see this as parallel to how characters view the pink opaque. And adult shows are often laughed at, with people reflecting on them as silly and weird, but the people who are willing to embrace that weirdness rather than laugh at it often find something deeper to connect to. Similarly, if you dismiss I Saw the TV Glow because it's weird and only for trans people, you can end up missing out on the broader themes that appeal to a variety of people. Classifying media as for solely one type of person because it appeals to a minority is a bad hill to die on, because rarely is something truly that exclusive. Usually there's at least something that resonates with everyone. This flawed ideology in judging media through an oversimplified binary of for me or not for me can be seen with how Owen's dad treats the show. He calls it a show for girls, which is a line of thinking that I'm sure various queer people have heard from others when they talk about media that they love. Queerness is about the tearing down of walls, and one of those walls is separating media off gender. The Pink Opaque being viewed as a girls' show pushes Owen away from it, even if he identifies with the show. It makes it embarrassing to identify with the show, because doing so would be perceived as a break from stereotypical manhood. As a result, Owen has to hide his love of the show from his parents. Owen yearning for that initial rush again is maybe one of the most realistic parts of this movie. Nothing beats that first drop of euphoria. It's like you see the world differently, even if you don't quite know why yet. You get to look at someone and envision yourself, and things finally feel right after a lifetime of them feeling wrong. Maybe you don't realize why yet, but you at least finally feel like you're living, instead of spectating. Maddie's interpretation of how the show makes her feel is heartbreaking, with her saying that it feels more real than real life. I really like this line from a thematic perspective, because it serves two purposes. First of all, Maddie is literally watching someone live out her life. The Pink Opaque is quite literally real life. Secondly, plays into the transgender allegory. She isn't living as herself, so her reality doesn't feel real. Watching someone live out what she wishes that she was feels more real, because that's what she is on the inside. I honestly don't remember what my first experience with gender euphoria was like, because it was so long ago. It may have been one of the Team Aqua Grunts in Pokemon Emerald, or maybe Buttercup from the Powerpuff Girls. The first show that gave me the feeling that Owen had with the Pink Opaque is probably Sailor Moon. I saw ads for Sailor Moon and recognized the Sailor Scouts, but I observed from a distance. I felt something looking at the show, but I just assumed that it was a feeling of, oh, this looks cool, rather than I wish that was me. I think one of the sharpest contrasts between Owen and Maddie comes from them watching the show together again, and Maddie starts crying. Nothing is worse than looking through a screen and seeing someone that you want to be. Maddie doesn't know what is wrong with her life, but something feels wrong enough that seeing someone else live her desired life is painful. Meanwhile, Owen is so deeply suppressed that the show activates something in him, but he isn't quite sure what yet. When the topic of orientation and gender comes up, Owen immediately pushes against it by saying that he likes TV shows, because it's similar to believe that he just enjoys the show, rather than it unlocking something deeper. Suppression is scary because if you bury your emotions too deep, it can feel impossible to ever dig them back up. For Owen, not thinking about it is easy. He gets by in life, and that is enough for him. He doesn't need to question why he loves the show, he just knows that he loves it. Trying to put how he feels about his gender into words is confusing, so why bother even thinking about it? That line of thinking is what messed with me the most when I was coming out, because it's how I processed things for a while. Over time, I realized that I was different from other people with how I felt about my gender. I felt myself wishing that I was a woman, but thinking that I'm fine as a man. I fully realized that I was transgender when I was 14, but I immediately threw it into the back of my brain. I consciously told myself, this is a problem for later in life. It's hard to feel comfortable with coming out as transgender when it opens up hundreds of new questions about yourself that you never had to consider before. If I can pass as a man with minimal effort compared to putting all of my energy into being respected as a woman, then why bother being a woman? I get by being a man. Isn't getting by enough? On the transitioning takes a whole lot of effort though. There's this one scene early on that sticks out to me. After Owen and Maddie watch the Pink Opaque together for the first time, Owen gets confused by all the plot elements and terminology being thrown around. I honestly can relate to feeling that way when I first started diving deep into queer terminology. Like, what the fuck is a gender fluid? You're telling me that I can just shift my gender to be one thing, two things, no things, and so much more? Like, that made no sense at first, and I got super discouraged. I felt dumb for not being able to understand it right away. But just like Maddie tells Owen, it's not something that you need to apologize for not understanding right away. You're not stupid for barely understanding everything the second that you get introduced to it. It's okay to need to take time to process and understand things. For me, my decision to transition had a sense of urgency, because I felt like I was dying. By going through with it, I ended my old life and finally got to start living my real one. This feeling of dying and being reborn is heavily embedded into I Saw the TV Glow, and this is most evident in the section where Maddie returns. Via the Pink Opaque Season 5 finale, we find out that what we thought was reality is actually the Midnight Realm, and that Owen and Maddie are actually a trapped Isabel and Tara. They're buried alive and are slowly dying. We get a chilling monologue from Mr. Melancholy where it says soon that Isabel won't even know that she is dying. Unless Owen goes through with burying himself, you won't be able to wake up back in reality as Isabel. The problem is that burying yourself alive is horrifying. Deep down, he knows that it's the right thing. Being buried alive isn't a process that you can undo. What I find interesting about this choice is that Maddie and Owen represent two very different perspectives. Their experiences within the Midnight Realm heavily contrast contrast. Maddie's home life is straightforwardly abusive, thus hearing screaming and a mention of her nose being broken in the past. She eventually escapes, but still finds nothing in the wider world. Meanwhile, Owen's home life isn't great, but he has good memories of both of his parents, and while he is sad, he still finds some joy in the world. As a result of these differences, it is arguably much easier for Maddie to make the leap of faith required to exit the Midnight Realm. Coming to terms with the world being fake is much easier when there isn't much holding you in it. This dichotomy is further illustrated by a similar conflict earlier in the film, where Owen backs out of running away with Maddie due to a love of his mother and the fear of not knowing where they'll end up. Coming out is an act of faith in two ways. First, you're putting faith in yourself and choosing to accept that you are transgender. And second, you're putting faith that the process will eventually work out in the way that leaves you better off than you were before. You don't know how it will end, you just believe that it will be an improvement. However, even if some people would want you to think otherwise, coming out isn't always a universal positive experience, so it can be an incredibly anxiety-inducing one. Coming out can honestly feel like you're burying the old you, because from that point on, people aren't going to look at you the same. There's no way to return to your old life, so you have to trust the feeling that's the right decision, which is scary. I waited months to tell anyone who knew me in person because I wanted to be able to back out of it. But eventually, not coming out is suffocation. You can die as the current you, or you can take the leap and be reborn as who you really are. After rejecting being buried, Owen waits for Maddie to return and force him underground, but really, nobody can choose for you. If you transition, it has to be your choice. Owen spends the rest of his life suffocating, which makes the movie feel like a funeral for the life that he never lived. The movie starts with Owen reflecting by a fire, and the way that it's edited makes it feel like he is contemplating the pivotal moments of his transgender experience. Perhaps the scariest part of Owen's choice is how he feels when he rewatches The Pink Opaque. He tries to pass it off as embarrassing. There's this whole online movement of people who reflect on their quote-unquote embarrassing transgender stage. Obviously, that's a semi-anecdotal note, and I'm not saying that there's a billion people doing this, but I've noticed quite a few of these, and honestly, it really struck a deep nerve. Being transgender is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I can't even imagine the timeline where I stayed in the closet, because I wouldn't exist. You can experiment with being transgender and then obviously not transition, but seeing posts where people talk about how they went by a different name and pronouns and then they quote-unquote grew out of it is really disheartening. We live in a world where it feels like you're pushed to not transition, because if you do, you're a problem. The truth is, being transgender can be messy, which is why it used to freak me out, and honestly, it still does. There's not an easy guide to figuring out your gender. It can be genuinely very embarrassing at times. I've had some truly disastrous outfits and names that I tried when first coming out. I used to pitch my voice in this one way, and that was horrible. Even at the time, I felt a little shame over everything. Point being, without those embarrassing experiences, I wouldn't be the woman that I am today. When so many people are born into their gender, and as a result, don't have to spend their late teen years and 20s figuring out who they are, it can feel hard to smile when I feel like I'm behind the cis people around me. If I had stopped and distanced myself from those emotions like Owen did, I would for sure reflect on them the same way that he, so many real people, do. You can't make your transgenderness disappear by pretending that it was an experiment. Before I transitioned, I'd put up with so much rhetoric about how I'm hopping on a trend or that it's just a phase. Like, nah, I am transgender, and no amount of suppression can ever change that. Unfortunately, the levels of transitioning differs for everyone, and this isn't an excuse to go out there and try to push every single person to transition, because there are numerous valid reasons for a trans person to not want to transition. It's an expensive process, and plenty of states are stripping away people's access to healthcare. There's a lot of social factors that make it unsafe to do so. Going back to the monologue from earlier, there's another line that I like from it. Maddie talks about how she moved to Phoenix. Now, even when she started using a different name, things didn't feel right. I experienced a similar crisis where I came out to people and moved, and at first, things felt great, but then it felt like I created my own new prison. One of the most common readings of Maddie is that she is some form of non-binary, which really resonates with me. When I first came out, I was gender fluid. Then I forced myself to be a good old she/her girly pop, because it felt like that was the only way that people would take the feminine part of me seriously. But then, I slowly started to feel like I was losing myself. People are now calling me by my preferred name and using she/her pronouns, but it didn't feel like me. I felt like I was spectating someone else's transition, not my own. I went from being stuck in a male box to being packaged in a brand new female box, and that just wasn't the life for me. So I decided that I needed to do the right thing for myself and come out as gender fluid/non-binary again. Even now I get put exclusively into the trans girl box a lot by other people, but I'm happy to say that I feel more like myself than ever. Sometimes I dress or act hyper-femme, other times I'm on the more masculine end of the spectrum. More than anything, I am finally me. At the end of the day, I saw a TV Glow's movie about being yourself, and I think that's why I got under my skin so much. I'm not always true to myself, and that is something that I'm always working on. I spent the first 16 years of my life lying to myself, and I don't want to sacrifice who I am for anyone. No social status is worth it if I have to roleplay as a cisgender person for it. Are some aspects of my life harder post coming out as transgender? Absolutely, but most importantly, it's at least my life now. I'm not just a spectator anymore, but I get to experience the joy of living. Over the summer, I was sitting in a cafe, writing an early, kinda dark draft of this video, and drinking a coffee. And for one of the first times in my life, things truly felt right. There's a billion things I could complain about when it comes to being transgender, and I certainly feel a constant anxiety over how fragile my rights are. But at the end of the day, I think I'd always choose the timeline where I'm transgender over one where I'm any form of cis. I love getting to be transgender and experiencing all the niche life experiences that come with it. Earlier in the video, I made a comment about how I'm only recently settled into my identity, but that's actually kind of lying. Sure, I know who I am right now, but that doesn't mean I'm going to identify the same way in the future. I might change, or maybe I stay the same. When I tell people that I figured myself out, I don't mean that I now magically know which labels best suit me and that's who I will be for the rest of my life. Really, what I mean is, I've learned to give myself space to be in flux. Nobody is ever stagnant. It is okay to give yourself leeway to be embarrassing and experiment no matter how old you are. There is always still time to redefine yourself. I saw a TV glow made me reflect on how the media I consumed as a child influenced me. As silly as it sounds, that's what even motivated me to make this video. What helped me get to where I am today was consuming media that made me feel so strongly about this whole transgender thing. So, even if it means I'm being vulnerable in a way that feels scary at times, I love doing it because getting to share my experience as a trans person feels worth it. It's a movie about escapism. While escaping my reality via media consumption helped me become comfortable with myself, it's not what I want the rest of my life to be. For Owen, happiness exists nearly exclusively within the glow of the TV. When he watches the Pinko Pig or opens himself up at the end of the movie, he is greeted with a warm knife that cuts through his cold reality. However, there is one other time we see him happy, when he tries to change his reality by wearing a dress. That's the type of reality I want to create for myself, one where I exist as me, rather than casting myself onto a screen. Watching this movie inspired me to do better for myself, because it's like looking at a bad alternate timeline. It's scary to exist, especially in a world that so frequently wants to challenge my own queerness. The alternative is watching my life play out like I'm spectating someone else's. If I'm gonna be me, then I have to be all of me. It's not always about changing everything, sometimes just the small things. Whether it be wearing weird outfits, throwing up flags, or cutting my hair. Life isn't made of exclusively the big swings like changing my name and starting HRT, but also those smaller moments. At the start of this video, I said that writing about being transgender freaks me out. And that's true, but that's not the full story. Yes, it's scary dissecting my own queerness, especially now that there's potentially hundreds of people that will watch me do so. At the same time, it's my favorite thing in the world. My simplest pleasure is finding ways to inject my writing with some queer angle. Being queer is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Even if it feels like I lost out on the first chunk of my life, there's always still time to live a better, more accurate life.